The wind off Lake Ontario had a particular bite to it that November evening, the kind that finds its way through wool and reminds you that winter in southern Ontario doesn't ask permission before it arrives. I stood in the kitchen of the Oakville house my late wife and I had built 31 years earlier, looking out at the garden she'd planted, and I made up my mind. I was going to lie to my children, all three of them, and I was going to do it in a way that would either save what was left of our family or finish it for good. My name doesn't matter much for this telling. What matters is that I'm 67 years old, a widower of 4 years, and the founder of a logistics company I'd spent 38 years building from a single warehouse in Mississauga into something worth a number I still have trouble saying out loud. My wife and I raised 3 children in this country, in this province, and somewhere along the way 2 of them learned to look at me the way you look at a bank machine, that occasionally tells you stories you don't want to hear. The third one, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. I called my lawyer that night, a man I'd known since the 80s, when we'd both been young and hungry and convinced Toronto would chew us up. His name isn't important either. What's important is that when I told him what I wanted to do, he didn't laugh. He didn't tell me I was being dramatic, or that grief had finally cracked something loose in me. He just listened, the way he always had, and then he said, "Are you sure?" I told him I'd never been more sure of anything since the day I asked my wife to marry me. We met 3 days later at his office on Bay Street, and we drew up the plan. A heart attack. A massive one. The kind that should have finished me but didn't. That would leave me supposedly bankrupt, supposedly destitute, supposedly without the resources to even pay for the rehabilitation I'd need. The company would have collapsed overnight due to a fabricated contract dispute with a major American client. The Oakville house would be in foreclosure. Everything would be gone. On paper. In the version of reality I was going to present to my children, my lawyer arranged everything. A doctor friend of his, retired from St. Michael's, agreed to play the role for a generous donation to his church in Scarborough. A fake hospital discharge summary. A cover story about how I'd been advised to convalesce somewhere with family, because home care was beyond my means now. The whole thing took us about 3 weeks to set up, and during those 3 weeks I kept thinking, this is madness. This is the kind of thing a man does when he's lost his mind. But then I'd remember the phone calls, the unreturned voicemails, the Christmases where my eldest hadn't even come into the kitchen to say hello to his mother before she got sick. The way my middle child had asked at her mother's funeral whether the lake property had been put in her name yet. And I'd think, no. This isn't madness. This is the last clear-eyed thing I'll ever do as their father. My eldest son is a cardiac surgeon at one of the big teaching hospitals in Toronto. I'm not going to name which one. 41 years old, married to a woman who works at one of the big 5 banks. 2 children who I've seen perhaps 11 times in their entire combined lives. He lives in a house in Forest Hill that cost more than my first 3 years of revenue when I started the company. He drives a German car that I'm fairly certain costs more than what I paid for my first house. He has never, not once, asked me how I'm doing without that question being followed within 2 sentences by something he needed. My middle child is a lawyer, corporate law, downtown Toronto, one of those firms with 3 names on the door where the partners pretend they don't keep score. 38 years old, divorced once already, no children by choice. She has a condo on the waterfront with a view of the islands and a cottage in Muskoka that I paid the down payment for back in 2019 as what she called a transitional gift. She specializes in mergers. She made partner last year. When her mother was dying, she came home for a weekend and spent most of it on her phone in the sunroom. My youngest is a nurse, 34 years old. She works night shifts in the geriatric ward at a hospital in Hamilton, the kind of work that grinds people down and pays them just enough to keep grinding. She lives in a basement apartment in Dundonts with her husband, a man who teaches high school history and coaches the junior boys hockey team, and their 4-year-old daughter. They drive a 2014 Honda Civic with 190,000 kilometers on it. She has not asked me for $1 in 8 years. Not since the time she needed help with the tuition for her final year, and I made her sign a repayment agreement that she finished paying off the month before her wedding. I am ashamed of that repayment agreement. I have been ashamed of it for years. I've never told her so. The week before American Thanksgiving, I made the calls. I had practiced the slurring in front of the mirror until I could do it without thinking. The fatigue in my voice came naturally, because I hadn't slept properly in years. I called my eldest first. He picked up on the fourth ring. There was the sound of a car. He was on his way somewhere. "Dad, I'm just heading into the hospital. Can I call you back?" I told him no. I told him I was at St. Joe's in Hamilton. I told him I'd had a heart attack, a serious one, that I'd been admitted overnight, that the doctors were saying I needed long-term rehabilitation and that something had gone wrong, terribly wrong, with the business, and I had nowhere to go. There was a pause on the line. Maybe 3 seconds, maybe 4, and then he said in the same voice he'd used when he was 16 and trying to get out of mowing the lawn, "Dad, I have a conference in Boston this weekend. I'm presenting. I can't really. This isn't really. Can you call back when you have more information?" I asked him if I could stay with him. Just for a few weeks. Just until I figured out what to do. He told me his wife was having work done on the kitchen. He told me the kids had a lot going on at school. He told me he'd send me the contact information for a social worker he knew through the hospital, someone who specialized in placement for. And here he stopped, looking for the word, and finally said, "For people in transition. For people in transition. For people in transition." My son, the cardiologist, could not bring himself to say the word elderly, or homeless, or father. I hung up before he could hear my breath change. I called my middle child next. She didn't pick up. I left a voicemail. She called me back 2 hours later, from what sounded like a restaurant. I could hear cutlery and laughter in the background. "Dad, what's going on? You said it was urgent." I told her the same thing. The heart attack. The business. The fact that I had nothing left. That the Oakville house was being repossessed. That I needed somewhere to go. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked, and I will remember this until the day I actually die. She asked whether any of the assets had been transferred to her name before the collapse. Whether the cottage was protected. Whether my will had been updated recently. I said I didn't know. I said I was confused. I said I just needed help. She said she'd look into the legal implications. She said she had a friend who did elder care advocacy and could probably get me on a wait list for a subsidized facility in Etobicoke. She said the shelter system in Toronto was actually quite robust now, that there were programs specifically for, and again that same word, men in transition. She said she was so sorry. She was at a client dinner. Could she call me tomorrow? She did not call me tomorrow. She did not call me tomorrow. I called my youngest last. I almost couldn't make myself dial. I'd told my lawyer I wanted to test all 3 that I needed to know, but standing in that kitchen with my finger over her name in my phone, I almost called it off. I almost drove to Hamilton and told her everything, because if she failed me too, I didn't know what I would do. I genuinely didn't. The plan didn't have a provision for all 3 of them failing. I hadn't allowed myself to imagine it. She picked up on the second ring. There was a child crying in the background, the soft, heaving kind that comes after a tantrum has passed. "Dad, hi, sorry, 1 second. Then to her daughter, gently, "Sweetheart, go find Daddy. Grandpa's on the phone." Then back to me. "Sorry, what's up?" I told her. All of it, the fabricated version. I made myself slur a little. I made myself cry, which wasn't hard because I'd been on the edge of crying for 2 days. She didn't say anything for about 5 seconds. Then she said, "Where are you right now?" I told her I was at the hospital in Hamilton. I told her they were going to discharge me in the morning, and I didn't have anywhere to go. She said, "I'm coming to get you. Don't go anywhere. I'm leaving in 20 minutes. I said, "Sweetheart, you don't have to. I can figure something out." She said, and I'm not making this up, she said, "Dad, stop. You're coming home with us. I have to make a couple of calls. Don't move." She hung up. I sat down on the kitchen floor of my Oakville house, with its garden and its view of the lake in the distance, and I cried until I couldn't see straight. 2 hours later, I was in the passenger seat of that 2014 Honda Civic, with my daughter at the wheel. driving along the QEW back toward Hamilton in the dark. She didn't ask me a single question about money. She didn't ask me what had happened to the company. She held my hand at a red light on Main Street and said, "We're going to figure this out, Dad. You're going to be okay." Her husband met us at the door of their basement apartment. He'd already set up the pull-up couch in what they used as a little office. His own daughter, my granddaughter, came running out in her pajamas, and when she saw me, she said, "Grandpa, are you sleeping over?" And her father said, "Yeah, kiddo. Grandpa's going to stay with us for a while." Like it was the most natural thing in the world. I lay on that pull-out couch that night and listened to my daughter and her husband talking quietly in the kitchen. They thought I couldn't hear them. She was crying. He was telling her it would be all right. She said she didn't know how they were going to afford my medications, on top of everything else. He said they'd figure it out. She said maybe they could sell her car. He said, no, you need the car for work. She said, well then, maybe we sell yours. He said his car was 11 years older than hers and worth about $1,200, and she laughed through her tears. The next morning, she made me oatmeal. She'd already called her supervisor at the hospital and arranged to switch some shifts so she could take me to a follow-up appointment that didn't exist. She'd already called her brother and her sister and left them messages telling them I was safe. Neither of them had called back. I stayed with them for 9 days. In those 9 days, I learned more about my youngest daughter than I had learned in the previous 15 years. I learned that she made her daughter's lunch every morning before her shift, peanut butter on whole wheat with the crust cut off, and a little note tucked into the lunchbox. I learned that her husband made her coffee in a thermos every night before her shift and left it by the door with a sticky note that said something different each time. I learned that they had a jar on top of the fridge where they put loose change, and the jar was labeled Disneyland Someday in their daughter's handwriting. I learned that on the 3rd day, my daughter sold her car. I didn't find out until later. She told her husband not to tell me. She'd taken it to one of those quick sale places on Barton Street and got $4,300 for it. She used the money to pay what she thought was a deposit on a rehabilitation program and a month of medication. The medication was, of course, a prescription her father didn't need, written by a doctor who didn't exist, picked up at a pharmacy that processed the transaction and quietly refunded everything to a holding account my lawyer had set up. But she didn't know that. She gave up her car for a lie I was telling her. When I found out, I went into the bathroom of that basement apartment and I sat on the edge of the bathtub and I put my face in my hands and I asked my dead wife to forgive me. I asked her over and over. On the 10th morning, my lawyer arrived at the door. I told my daughter the night before that someone was coming to see me. I told her it was a friend of mine, someone helping me sort out the business situation. She'd nodded and said okay and made extra coffee. When he came in, with his briefcase and his good wool coat and his apologetic smile, he sat down at their little kitchen table and he asked my daughter and her husband to sit down. He'd asked me beforehand if I wanted to be the one to tell them, and I'd said no. I couldn't. I was too much of a coward. He told them everything. He told them that there had been no heart attack. He told them that there was no foreclosure on the Oakville house. He told them that the company had not collapsed, that in fact, the company had just been valued, in preparation for sale, at 112 million Canadian dollars. He told them that I had constructed this entire situation as a test of my children's character, because I had been losing my faith in all of them, and I had needed to know. My daughter looked at me. She didn't say anything. She just looked. My son-in-law said very quietly, "Sir, that's a horrible thing to do to her." I said I knew. I said I'd been trying to find the words to apologize for 9 days, and I couldn't find them. My daughter said, "You let me sell my car." I said yes. I said I had let her do that. I said I would buy her any car she wanted, any car in any showroom in this country, but I knew that wasn't the point. I knew I had no right to ask anything of her ever again. She got up. She walked into her daughter's bedroom. She closed the door. I sat at that kitchen table for what felt like an hour. My son-in-law made another pot of coffee. He didn't speak to me. My lawyer waited patiently, the way he'd waited for me on 100 deals over the years. Eventually, my daughter came back out. Her eyes were red. She sat down across from me. She said, "Why?" I told her. I told her about her brother and his conference. I told her about her sister and the question about the cottage. I told her about the years and years of phone calls that ended with requests, and the holidays where I'd watched her drive away with leftovers from a Thanksgiving dinner her brother and sister hadn't bothered to attend, and the time I'd seen her at her mother's grave, alone, 3 months after her siblings had stopped going. I told her I had needed to know if there was anything left of the family her mother and I had built. I told her I had been so afraid that there wasn't. She listened. She didn't cry again. When I finished, she said, "Dad, you could have just asked me. You could have just called me and asked me to come home, and I would have come." "I know," I said. "I know that now." My lawyer opened his briefcase. He took out the documents. The sale of the company was scheduled to close in 7 weeks. The proceeds, after taxes and the expenses of the transition, would amount to approximately $79 million. I had instructed him to allocate this in the following way: $56 million in a structured trust to my youngest daughter and her husband and their daughter, the Oakville house, free and clear, to my youngest daughter. The cottage on Lake Simcoe, where my wife had taught all 3 of them to swim, to my youngest daughter. A separate education trust for my granddaughter that would cover any educational pursuit she could imagine, from kindergarten to a doctorate at any institution in the world. To my eldest son and my middle daughter, $8 million each, to be paid out, however, in quarterly installments of $200,000 over 10 years, with conditions. The conditions were that they each commit, on signed legal agreement, to 400 hours of volunteer service per year at a long-term care facility, a homeless shelter, or a hospice, to be verified independently. If they refused, the $8 million reverted to the trust for their sister's family. If they failed to complete the hours in any given year, that year's payment was forfeited. My daughter looked at the page for a long time. She said, "Dad, this is too much." I said it was not nearly enough. I said it was 20 years too late. The next afternoon, my son drove down from Toronto. He'd gotten a message from my lawyer the night before. He came in his German car and parked it on the street in Dundas, where it looked like a spaceship had landed in front of a basement apartment. He sat at the kitchen table where I'd betrayed his sister and listened to my lawyer explain everything. When my lawyer got to the part about the conditions on his inheritance, my son said, 400 hours a year? At his shelter? My lawyer said yes. My son said, "Dad, I have a practice. I have patience. I can't just." I said, "Then don't." He looked at me. He looked at his sister. He looked at the small kitchen with its 40-year-old appliances and the jar on top of the fridge that said Disneyland someday in a child's handwriting. He didn't say anything for a long time. Finally said, "Why is she getting the house?" That was what he said. With his sister sitting across from him, after 9 days of her being the only one of his siblings who had answered the phone when their father said he was alone in a hospital. That was the question he had. My middle daughter arrived 2 hours later. She'd flown back early from a work trip in Calgary. She wore a suit. She read the documents twice. She asked questions about the trust structure. She asked questions about the tax implications. She asked one question about her sister, which was whether the cottage on Lake Simcoe was the same one she had spent her summers at as a child, and when I said yes, she nodded once and went back to the documents. She did not look at her sister the entire time. When my lawyer finished explaining the conditions, my eldest daughter, the lawyer, the corporate one, the one who had once asked at her mother's funeral about a property transfer, looked up at me and said, "Dad, I want you to know. I understand what you're doing. And I deserve it. I want you to know that I know I deserve it." She started crying. My son didn't. My son was still looking at the documents like he was trying to find a loophole. I sat there with my 3 grown children in my youngest daughter's basement apartment in Dundas, Ontario, and I thought about my wife. I thought about her in the garden in Oakville the year before she got sick, planting tulips that would come up the spring after she died. I thought about how she would have hated what I'd done, and how she would have understood it. It's been almost 2 years now. The sale closed. The trust is funded. My granddaughter started junior kindergarten in the fall, and her tuition at a small school in Hamilton, the kind with art programs and a music teacher, is being paid by the trust without anyone in her family ever having to think about it. My daughter quit her night shifts. She works days now at a hospice in Burlington 3 days a week. Her husband still teaches. They moved out of the basement apartment into a house on a quiet street with a backyard and a maple tree. I live in the Oakville house, still, but I drive out to see them every Sunday, and my granddaughter has a room there with her name on the door that her grandmother would have loved. My son completes his 400 hours. He does them grudgingly, at a long-term care facility in North York, and his wife does not understand why he does it. But he does. I think slowly. He is learning something. I am not sure. I am too tired to be sure of much anymore. My middle daughter exceeds her hours every year. She volunteers at a women's shelter in downtown Toronto. She doesn't talk to me about it. We have lunch once a month. She is, I think, a different person than she was. Or perhaps she is becoming the person she would have been if I had paid better attention earlier. I'm trying not to ask too much of her. I'm trying not to ask too much of any of them ever again. What I want anyone to take from this, if anyone should ever hear it, is just this. You do not test the people you love. I did, and I do not regret what came of it. But I regret the doing of it. I regret making my daughter sell her car. I regret making her husband stay up worrying about my medications. I regret asking my granddaughter if Grandpa could sleep over. If you are wondering whether your children love you, ask them. Just ask them. Don't make them prove it. The cost of finding out the answer the way I did, it is not a cost I would wish on anyone, even the ones who fail the test. And if you are the child of an aging parent in this country, in this cold country with its long winters and its quiet houses, please pick up the phone when they call. You do not know what it costs them to dial. I have thought about that November a great deal in the time since. About the kitchen floor in Oakville where I sat and cried after my youngest said she was coming to get me. About the pull-out couch in a basement apartment in Dundas, where I slept for 9 nights while my daughter and her husband whispered about how to afford medications I did not need. About the jar on top of their fridge that said Disneyland someday in a 4-year-old's handwriting. What I have come to understand, slowly, is that nothing in a family arrives by accident. My eldest son did not become a man who could not say the word father because he was born that way. He became that man because his mother and I worked too hard and noticed too little, and we let his successes speak for him until he forgot how to speak for himself. My middle daughter did not learn to ask about property transfers at her mother's funeral out of nowhere. She learned it from watching me put a price on every kindness I ever extended, including, God forgive me, the kindness I extended to her sister, who I made sign a repayment agreement for tuition when she was 22 years old. Cause and effect. We talk about it like it's some abstract law, but it lives in the small rooms of a house. Every time I chose the warehouse over a school concert, I planted something. Every time my wife forgave my absences without asking me to do better, she planted something too. The harvest came 30 years later in 3 different forms, in 3 different children, and the harvest was honest even when it was hard to look at. I do not believe my children's character was fixed from the start. I believe character is built in small bricks every day by the people we love and the choices we make in front of them. My youngest became the woman who drove down the QEW in the dark to pick up a father she thought was destitute, because somewhere along the way she had decided that love was not something you withheld until the conditions were favorable. I do not know exactly where she learned that. I would like to think she learned some small part of it from her mother. I would like to think the rest she taught herself. If there is anything I would say to a younger version of myself, sitting in that warehouse in Mississauga in '97, it would be this. The business you are building will not love you back. The money you are making will not visit you when you are old. Strength is not the ability to provide. Strength is the willingness to sit at a small kitchen table in a small apartment and listen to your child tell you the truth about who you have been. Wisdom is the patience to change before the lesson has to be taught the hard way. In decency, real decency is not measured by what we give when we have plenty. It is measured by what we give when we have nothing, to people who can give us nothing back. I learned that lesson late. I learned it from a night shift nurse who sold her Honda Civic for a father who did not deserve her. I am trying, in whatever years I have left, to be worthy of what she taught me.